It's Lucy Litch, and this is Tiny House Conversations. It's the Australian-based podcast where I interview experienced tiny houses, tiny builders, and adventurers in the tiny world so you can discover how to create, build, and transition into tiny life. Before we get into the show, I'd love to know, is there a particular topic you'd like to learn more about, or a guest in the tiny house world that you'd love me to get on the podcast? Maybe you know of a tiny houser with an interesting story, or a tiny builder who builds amazing tiny homes and offers a professional, ethical, and reliable service. Or maybe you know of other experts or adventurers in the tiny house space who have a message that needs to be heard. Whatever the case, I'd love to hear from you, and you can head over to tinyhouseconversations.com/request. If you enter your guest or topic request there, I'll do what I can to make it happen for you. Thanks so much. Now let's intro today's episode. Welcome back to Tiny House Conversations. Today is a different kind of podcast, and in this episode, we'll be recapping some of the highlights of many different episodes from this year. And this episode in particular will be episode 1 of 3 of going through all the different podcasts of this year. Just like anything in life, I feel like it's really great to reflect, look back on things, see how far we've come, remember the lessons that we've learned, remember the experiences that we had, especially as the year starts to draw to a close. It's always nice to just remember where we came from and also remember why we do what we do, and perhaps even remember some of those mistakes that we've made or the lessons that we've learned. We've had to relearn them again and again. And just looking back at this journey of the podcast. So this episode will be episode number 47. And so it's been almost a year since, the Tiny House Conversations podcast has been alive, bringing you many different guests week after week, as well as sharing my own personal journey. And there's been so many amazing people that I've had the privilege and the honor and the gratitude of speaking with and connecting with on the podcast, many of whom I hope to be able to meet in person in the coming year, maybe at a Tiny Homes Expo or elsewhere. So I really can't wait to just recap and go back to the start in this episode and remember all the great nuggets of wisdom that these guests share with us from their own personal experience of tiny house living, or from their own personal expertise in some of the different topics that you want to know more about. So first up in episode number 2, I spoke with Colin and Megan Leeson, and in this highlight, Colin talks about the importance of getting along with your neighbours and building that connection and that great relationship.
For many people living in a tiny house, they do so in what we call under the radar, so not having gone through council processes. I'm sure there are a few really important steps to being able to do that. One of them is to get on really well with your neighbours, because councils typically are aware that people are living in tiny houses but aren't necessarily going to action anything about moving them on unless there's a complaint. But when we arrived here, the number one priority was to get along with our neighbours. So they're friendly with us, they're not going to make any kind of complaint against us. I think we're probably battling a bit of a stereotype. When people think tiny houses, they're probably going to think trailer park. To be able to set an example of not being that, to be a professional couple living in a very smart, if not sought after house, is again really important. The sewerage thing and the incinerating toilet thing, I think, fits into that as well. And people and councils being concerned on how you're going to deal with that. So yeah, getting along with the neighbours is really, really important.
That's a really great insight from Colin. I know that with tiny house regulations, it's a very big grey area. They don't fit neatly into caravan regulations or the building codes. And in terms of parking and where you can do that, the councils don't really know what to do with them. And as Colin mentioned, I think most people are living under the radar in a tiny house. And so whether you choose to go through your local council or not, I think it's always a great idea to connect with your neighbours as much as possible for many different reasons. Now, next up, we have Emmett Blackwell from episode number 3. And in this highlight, Emmett talks about how he managed to find about 30 parking space offers in 48 hours for his tiny house. So you mentioned earlier about how you found your parking space for your tiny home in Byron. Did you find that a relatively easy process? Like, did you have a lot of people come back?
It was quick and easy. I was really surprised. I think within 48 hours, I had a list of 30 properties within half an hour drive of Byron Bay. It was incredible. I didn't get to visit some of those. I just picked the couple that were top of the list, and they all worked out. But it was really nice to kind of put it out there, be optimistic and hopeful. And a lot of people are really fearful, I think, of I see a lot of questions online of people that are contemplating tiny houses, and that might be a really significant barrier of feeling a bit daunted by that process of finding land. But I just kind of wish for the best and put it out there, and I had a really positive response. So I was very fortunate, but it was nice to have that choice, I guess, of being able to pick and choose a bit, and just be really clear about what you're looking for. And if you've got a cute picture of your tiny house, it'll definitely help.
Isn't that amazing? About 30 offers in 48 hours. And it just goes to show that when you put yourself out there, you never know what opportunities could come your way. And I think we can take that lesson and that insight into everything that we do in our lives. And I know that finding a parking space for your tiny house, I know that that's one of the hurdles, the most frequently asked about questions, and the things that people often feel could be a limiting factor in their tiny house journey. But I feel like I haven't heard of a situation where someone hasn't been able to find a parking space. I know that it can be tricky because it's like, okay, I can't afford land myself. I don't know anyone in my life, whether it's friends or family members that have land that might have a spare piece of it to rent out for a tiny house. And so what can I do? So I would recommend listening to episode number 3 with Emmett, because he shares more about the process that he went through. I would also recommend checking out episode number 12 with Bryony Jenkinson from Park My Tiny House, who has a platform specifically for connecting landowners with people that are looking for parking spaces for their tiny houses. And then episode number 46 with myself, where I share my own tiny house parking story and my journey with that and the process that I went through. And there's many different options, which is great news. So you don't have to worry that, you know, that's going to be the hardest part of the journey, because I feel like, at least from my experience, it was probably one of the, and I won't say easiest, but let's say unexpectedly, it wasn't as challenging as I thought it was going to be. Now, next up, from episode number 4, I spoke with Ryan and Ziski, who are in New Zealand. And in this highlight, they share about how they approached the DIY building process for their tiny house. Let's have a listen.
One of the biggest struggles with the build was managing our different expectations. So I see success in terms of progress. For me, there were days when I didn't feel as though we were progressing enough. And naturally, there's sort of frustration that comes with that, you know, feeling as though, I wish we had have got to, you know, we had have completed this job or got closer to completion of a particular area or something like that. That sort of expectation that we would progress a certain amount not being met would leave me feeling a bit disheartened. And I think, you know, when you're working with someone else, when one person's feeling frustrated, there's one of two ways that the other party can kind of go. I think the way that that Ziski handled that was just so beautiful for our relationship, because she would help me to sort of understand that maybe moving forward we can look at each day in terms of what would success look like today, and we'd define that at the beginning of the day. If we were able to achieve that version of success, able to progress in that amount, what would a bonus be on top of that? And so I started looking at our progress very differently. It was much more manageable and bite-sized, rather than going, I want to get all of the internal lining done within the next couple of days, and then being disappointed when naturally, you know, it'd take a little bit longer than expected.
And with a big project as well, sometimes the progress can be quite hard to identify because there's so many things that aren't done. And so actually taking the time to look at what has been done, I think that was quite helpful for us as well. Of having these milestones that we'd celebrate, you know, when we got building paper on, it was still really cold. It was winter, I think. And we sat on just the subfloor on our trailer with the building wrap on, and had pizza and a bottle of wine. And we were just like, this is amazing. We've gotten to this point. And actually just acknowledging it, because otherwise it can feel really, like you were saying, really disheartening because, well, the house still isn't finished. And that was a really helpful thing for us, just to keep that motivation up for the year and a bit that we were building.
Listening to that reminds me of that idea of, how do you eat an elephant? You don't try to eat it all in one go. You break it down into manageable, small parts. And then at some point, all of these small things, or we can say these tiny things, become something really big and, something that maybe seems so impossible or overwhelming, or how are we actually going to get this done at the start, and then going through all these little steps along the way and these practical aspects. And, all of these pieces come together to form this really beautiful thing at the end. So I can imagine how challenging, but also really rewarding by the end of the DIY building process it would have been. And now next up, from episode number 5, I spoke with April Whiston from Cabin Connect. And in this highlight, April talks about using tiny homes for multi-generational living.
If you can have the grandparents living in the same house as the family or on the same property, it's becoming a lot more cost effective. There's people there to supervise the children, all those sorts of things. So we're definitely seeing a lot of inquiries come through to us where people are saying, oh, my daughter's having a baby. I'd really love her to move back home and, live in a tiny house in our backyard so that we can be there to provide care and support, because she's still going to have to work. Multi-generational living and a tiny house is a really great option. It's a great solution. It reduces isolation and loneliness in older people. It provides caregiving services for young families, and it offers children the opportunity to live and be around their extended family, which is so valuable. So if we can find tiny houses moving more into your family environment, I think it's only a good thing, really.
I couldn't agree more with what April shared, and I feel like that's actually one of the big benefits and appeals to me about tiny house living. I know for me that the older that I get, the more experiences that I have in life, the more that I remember how important it is to have my family close by as much as possible, or at least to be able to keep that connection with the family. And, because of the lowered costs of living and because of the portability of tiny homes and many other aspects, it does have this opportunity for families to be reconnected and to have several generations living on the same property. So I think that's really beautiful. And I hope that we're able to see more of that in the future for tiny homes. And next up, I have my dear friend Claire Lovelace, who joined me on the show at episode number 6, where we talked about her van life experiences. And in this preview, Claire shares some of her tips or advice for downsizing and moving into small space living.
Just know that everything will be okay. You'll always be supported. In terms of living in a small space, I really feel like less is more. Like the more stuff that you can get rid of, the easier it is, because the more stuff you have, the more you have to organize things and find place for things. Simple is best. Don't worry about anything. Don't overthink things, because I think that we can talk ourselves out of things so easily. The moment that I realize that my mind is going into like, oh yeah, but then this might happen, or then this might happen. No, stop, just do it. It's like you just got to jump and trust that the net will appear. It depends on what kind of person you are. I'm definitely not someone that likes to prepare things at all. So I just like to go for it. I think that you can get really stuck on that preparatory part and then never do it. So I would just go for it, and you can just figure it out along the way.
There's many great insights in there from Claire, and one in particular that she said at the end about, planning and then never actually taking action to do something. And again, I think this can apply to so many things that we do in life, including wanting to maybe move in a tiny house. And of course, there are many different reasons, and we're all at different parts of the journey and we have different situations, and maybe for some of us, it's not as easy as just going, yep, I want to do it, because maybe the financial aspect's not there, or a certain life situation is present at the moment, which kind of stops us from moving forward straight away. But I think that you can have an idea of where you want to head. And then again, it's coming back to those small steps, even if it's just something really small once a week or once a month, or, however is manageable for you. It's taking those small steps to put things into action. And I also love the thing about the material items. I know for me, I'm a minimalist at heart. And so really considering like how much stuff do we actually need? How much stuff do we use day to day, and what is not necessary? All right, next up, I spoke with Lisa Tranter on episode number 7 of the podcast. And in this preview, Lisa talks about some of the things that she loves most about tiny house living. And I feel like this is kind of like a list of many of the benefits of tiny house living. So let's have a listen.
I like the tiny house because it's a much more cozy feeling space. Like, I don't feel, although we've got things and knickknacks in our house and more by the year that we live here, but I don't feel obligated to fill those spaces with anything. I feel like I have just what I need and I don't need anything else. I don't need spare rooms. I don't need things, material things. I like the fact that we're both saving money by not buying random things. I like that cleaning only takes me half an hour to 45 minutes on a bad day and not 2 hours every second or third day to clean the entire house. I like the warmth that a small house brings, and I like to spend more time outside. So I guess having a small house means that you can't really be inside to do something. So you're obligated to spend more time outside.
One of the things that stood out for me was not needing to fill the space unnecessarily. And I actually think of that in a physical way, not filling space with material stuff, but also, sometimes in life we can keep ourselves busy and just move from the next thing to the next thing to the next thing. And we don't allow ourselves any personal space to just be and to reflect and to integrate lessons and to just simply be in stillness and not have to do. I think that there can be this tendency to want to just continue to fill that space, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, because we're avoiding facing certain emotions or situations or whatever it might be. So I really love that idea of not filling the space unnecessarily on whatever level, whatever dimension you want to think of that in. Okay, next up, from episode number 8, I spoke with Jan and Kev Y, and in this highlight, they share some of their perspective shifts that they've experienced from tiny house living.
It really does clear your mind. When you're not worried about getting the car or the big house or things like that, it just makes you concentrate on more and appreciate more what you've got in the world, as in outside living. Oh, the big appreciation for me is how valuable water is now.
So you're more aware of nature, and you're more aware of your impact on the planet. So because you live in as you do, you just become aware of what's going on around you and what you can do, even as one person, your impact on the people around you as well.
There's another benefit of tiny house living, minimizing our impact on the earth and becoming much more aware of the resources that we use. I know for me, that's a huge part of the appeal of tiny house living, and something that I'm really conscious about and want to do better at is, managing these resources and also, being more involved in the everyday workings, whether it's with, managing the composting toilet system, the solar system, and, other different aspects. And so, it seems to be a very common experience, especially if you're going off grid or partially off grid. And next up, I spoke with Kathy and Matt McMillan on episode 9 of the podcast. And in this highlight, Kathy talks about how someone selling a tiny home can think about tiny house finance.
Something that people who are considering borrowing money for a tiny house is it can be quite tricky getting finance. A lot of the banks won't touch a tiny house loan. They're not really recognised so much as being an asset that they can securitise. We borrowed from a finance company, and the maximum we could borrow, and this is the case for most personal loans, is $50,000. The remaining $17,000, the seller actually offered vendor finance, which was so smart of him because he knew that most lenders will only lend $50,000. So we're paying him back as well. His loan's prioritised, so we're getting that paid off this year. But I think that's something tiny house owners should also keep in mind when they're selling their houses, is what finance the buyer will actually be able to easily get, and consider offering vendor finance, because if we hadn't been offered that, then we may not have been able to buy it, or it might have meant that we couldn't move in for a lot longer because we'd have to save up to pay for solar for a lot longer. So that's something to keep in mind, is the finance side of it can be a little bit tricky. If you've got, say, a parent who's willing to go guarantor and put their home as an asset, then you can borrow a bit more.
It's an interesting point that Kathy mentioned about the seller offering finance to the buyer of a tiny house. And since the time of recording, there's a tiny house finance company called Great Escape Finance who's been doing some great work in this area for the last couple of years. And I actually interviewed the founder, or the co-founder, Paul Pritchett, on episode number 15. So you can go and check that out if you want to know more, and obviously get in contact if you need to know more about tiny house finance, or if you want to look into what options are available for you. Now, next up, on episode 10 of the podcast, I spoke with Michelle Rees, and in this preview, she talks about expanding the awareness and insight of her kids through tiny house life.
For them, they love the outdoors, they love the space, they love to be able to run free and enjoy the animals as well. So that's a big part of life up there for them. I just think for them, it's about them growing up with a really different level of insight around our impact on the earth and our usage of resources, and I guess that connection and respect for the planet. I think it is something that initially we had to work on with them, don't leave the tap on and walk away, that kind of thing, and clearly some coaching around how to use the composting toilet and so on. But now it's just become part of their lives and part of who they are. And I think that's a level of insight that everyone will benefit from them having, I think, because the respect that they have for the earth and the resources is just so much greater than would have otherwise been the case had they not had those experiences at this young age.
The more that I speak to families that live in tiny homes that have small kids, the more I am reminded just how beautiful of a way it would be for them to grow up, in their early years, having an experience of living completely differently to, if you were living in a larger house or a unit or something in the suburbs, in urban areas, and really having this different way of life through tiny house living. And it's not going to be for everyone. I know that some people will think, oh, well, I don't know that I could live with my kids in a smaller space and all of that kind of stuff. And the reality is, some people are doing it and they're making it work, and it's actually the best thing that they've ever done for their family. So it's really interesting. But again, of course, it's not going to be for everyone. And I think just like the benefits that we receive through tiny house living is very similar for the kids, and they get to grow up in the most beautiful way. All right, next up on episode 10 of the podcast, I spoke with Paul Bent-Velzen, who is an insurance broker from Sydney and also owns a tiny home. And at the time of recording, the tiny house insurance options were very limited, which they still are. But it's interesting to hear Paul's foresight on, what kind of shifts need to happen in order for tiny house insurance to be more available in the tiny house space.
When the market starts to increase, which it is doing, once the demand starts hitting insurers, which it is, I think down the track you'll see insurers adjust their policies or coming out with specific policies that might be tailored to the tiny home Airbnb type concept as well. And then when that happens, that'll pick up the claims. The claims will start coming through, and the insurance company will be able to rate it accordingly based on the claims, the loss ratio for that type of insurance line. And then you might see where one insurer responds, others do as well. So then once you start to get some competition within the marketplace, then we can start to see some relief in regards to premiums. At the moment, the caravan insurance policies, you can get varying. You can get the basic mobile caravan that you tow behind your car as well, which is super cheap. And then you can get the tiny house that's got the higher option on there, which is static, which could be super expensive. As the growth of the tiny movement happens, I think we'll start to see more specialised insurers come in.
Interestingly, since the time of recording this episode, CIL, who was the main tiny house insurance or caravan insurance company, stopped providing insurance for new tiny house policies. However, the Australian Tiny House Association in the background has been working really hard alongside another insurance company to bring about a policy specifically for tiny houses on wheels. And so if you want to know more about that, I would check out the Australian Tiny House Association, because that's really exciting news, and hopefully there will be more to come. Okay, moving on to episode number 12, I spoke with Bryony Jenkinson from Park My Tiny House. And in this highlight, Bryony talks all about the positive domino effect that landowners can have if they offer space for a tiny house to park on their land. And it's really great to hear the big picture view on this. So let's listen to what Bryony has to say.
It's not just the host and landowner, it's so much bigger than just those two individuals involved. It means tiny house building companies will go gangbusters because more people will be commissioning to build tiny houses if they know they've got somewhere to put it. The builders burgeoning means that they're going to have new employees, so unemployment can potentially be reduced. There can be many more people involved in the industry building. And then there's this massive flow-on effect, means if there's more people living in tiny houses on whether it's rented land or their own land, then that's reducing the potential burden on the housing industry. I mean, I'm hearing stories from all sorts of people having to find a rental property at the moment. It's absolutely horrendous. Like, people are having to go to 40 or 50 open houses and putting in that many applications to even get a look in at one house. It's so bad. Yet there's the tiny house opportunities going, hello, me over here. You know, it just seems like such an obvious thing. And I don't see maybe tiny houses on wheels as a forever solution, but for the short to medium term, I would be taking up a rental if I wasn't in a tiny house on my own land right now. And then that would, reduce the opportunity that another mum with kids or someone might have to find secure housing. So by not putting that burden on the system, then, the government's not having to subsidise as many, and they're not having to build as many, housing solutions and affordable housing. So to reduce some of the burden on that is, good for the government as well.
Landowners, if you're listening to this episode, if you've got space on your land and, there's not really that much going on there, you could definitely earn some income on the side. You could make relationships with tiny houses and form this community and, get help tending to the land and regenerating the land and all of those types of things too. So I think it's like a really great way to make this lifestyle more accessible and to connect people within this lifestyle as well.
Oh, absolutely. So on the financial benefits side of things for hosts and landowners, the properties that we have available range from free in doing some work on the property, maybe some clearing or some fencing or looking after some chooks and animals occasionally, right up to, I think, $250 a week for a beautiful property on the Central Coast, New South Wales, which is in the rainforest and has a trickling creek running through the property, which provides full off-grid solar power, water, septic and everything. So it's a massive spectrum of what's available, but there's plenty of options depending on what your scenario is too.
This is another reminder at just how important it is to bring tiny houses into the affordable housing conversation and for it to be a solution to affordable housing for so many more people. Sadly, when I moved to the south coast of New South Wales in the middle of 2022, I kept hearing of so many families being kicked out of their homes because maybe they couldn't afford to pay the rising prices of rent, and families were living in camping grounds, on the street, staying at the airport. And this is happening all around the country and other parts of the world as well. And so as you can hear about everything that Bryony just shared there's so many benefits to tiny house living, and so many groups of people can benefit from this way of living being more accessible to more people. So then on to episode number 13 with Anthony and Kira. And in this preview, they talk about relationships in a small space and how you really need to be aware of each other.
You've got to be aware of each other. Well, if you're a couple or if you're more than one person, you really do have to respect the other person's space and know that you're in a tiny space and that you can't go anywhere else and just have your downtime unless you want to go for a walk somewhere. And we're dealing with it. We've had our moments, of course, but we talk them through. But if I'm doing something anywhere in this space, Kira's going to hear it and vice versa.
Yeah, that's the thing. People who are thinking about getting a tiny house need to understand. I mean, and they could build in a design where they've got a bedroom with a door. I have seen those. But for the most part, if you're going for the loft option, so you've got more livable space on the main floor level, you're essentially living on a shelf above the kitchen and living room. And with that comes communal space. Your personal bedroom and your personal space is now in a communal space 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
And if people just pop around and want to visit, you've both got to, be social.
I mean, we've had some great chats about things because early morning movements and noise levels and, morning activities if one person is still needing to rest. I mean, we have a great thing because Anthony works in a bakery and gets up at 1:30 in the morning every Wednesday and comes home at 6 in the morning, and I'm a light sleeper. So he's had some wonderful opportunity to learn how to tiptoe amongst the tulips. Otherwise, I have an entire day where I don't sleep until the following night. You've got to know that going in, that you're actually going to be in a shared space, and it does provide for really good relationship building conversations.
It's such an interesting conversation to have more than one person in a small space, and the amount of times that I've spoken about this with people, with couples, with families of, when you are living in a small space, it's almost like there's no place to hide, or you really need to be intentional about finding space for yourself, whether it's going for a walk, whether it's having a specific part of the house built in, or not having that space, and really needing to navigate that and manage that and have these open conversations, just like what Anthony and Kira are talking about. So I really love that, because I think it's a very common thing that people need to navigate, because our physical space is so much smaller. And it's like, okay, instead of being able to go into another part of the house in the bedroom where, you can't really hear anything, you can be like really removed from the person or the situation or the environment. It's really hard to be able to do that. And next up on episode 14, I spoke with Matt Porter from SAE Group all about off-grid solar systems for tiny homes. And in this highlight, Matt talks about some of the important considerations for finding a solar system that is right for you.
Getting it right the first time is probably a big thing. I've had a lot of customers that have opted for cheap equipment and it's come back to bite them, and they've ended up having to pay twice. Get an installer that knows what they're talking about. Do a proper energy audit so that you can make sure that your system's sized to what you need. We always build in a bit of a fudge factor anyway, so because people's usage will grow, family might grow, things like that. So there's always a bit more that you build in. And then quality components, get as best as what you can afford at the time. If you can get high-end stuff at the start, then that's good, because then that just lengthens the amount of time before you have to spend money again. So make sure the system's sized correctly. You don't want an undersized system. You also don't want an oversized system, because you end up paying more money than what you should have. And then quality components, and then make sure the installation is done properly as well. There's no point spending big bucks on top quality equipment if the installation's done poorly, because then you're just going to have dramas anyway.
Some great points from Matt here. I know one of the most common questions that I see in different tiny house Facebook groups and just that I hear from speaking to different people is, what are the best solar systems out there? What is everyone else using? And the thing about that is, yes, you can get all the recommendations you want from different people all day long, but the key is that everyone's needs are going to be completely different, because everyone lives in different ways, has different usages for their devices, has different appliances, has different amounts of people, and, you know, depending on if someone's working from home or not, or just have different ways of living, which are then going to really dictate, you know, how much or how big of a solar system or how small of a solar system you're going to need. And then I really love the point about getting as best quality as you can afford, because as we know, usually, you know, you get what you pay for, and, you know, would hate to have to, you know, pay for something again and again and again, instead of maybe just investing a bit more upfront. So yeah, really good things to consider. And for the final highlight in this episode, from episode 15, I spoke with Anthony Smith from Water Wally all about grey water systems and composting toilets. And in this highlight, Anthony talks about the environmental considerations of using hemp for your composting toilet bulking material.
A lot of people like the idea of using hemp in composting toilets, and the product itself is totally fine. But I've also found that the hemp that is currently available in Australia is imported from Holland. The energy sources that goes in harvesting this hemp in Holland and then shipping it all the way over to Australia just so that you can throw it in your toilet, it certainly isn't ticking the eco warrior sustainability boxes.
Yeah, absolutely. It had to travel all those miles, and there's the transportation and the petrol and the, you know, everything else that's gone into that to get to you.
Well, yeah, exactly. And one thing, going all the way back to what we started talking about, how precious water is as a resource and how much water has gone into that process and that transportation in getting that bit of hemp all the way over to you. We're not ticking the eco boxes in regards to water conservation.
It just goes to show that we can't always trust these labels or these perceptions of something being eco-friendly or sustainable, and that it really is important to do our due diligence, to do our research, and to go deeper into, you know, knowing more about these things that are often being sold to us as the healthier option, the more sustainable option, the more environmentally friendly option. And, you know, when it comes to industry, we know that often there are conflicts of interest, or there are financial interests that are more important than something being good for the consumer, being good for the environment, being good for our health. And so I really love these insights that Anthony shared with us around that, because I certainly thought that hemp was one of the better options. And maybe it is in many different ways, but there's also the bigger picture and these other pieces to the puzzle too, of having it travel halfway across the world just to, as Anthony said, just to go into your toilet. And that's it for this episode. I hope that you enjoyed listening back to some of the great highlights and pieces of wisdom from each of my guests on these episodes. I will put links in the show notes at tinyhouseconversations.com/047 to all the podcast conversations that these guests appeared on, in case you haven't listened to them before, and you can go back and check those out, as well as contact details for all my guests in case you want to get in contact with them, ask questions, or work with them, or whatever it might be. And as always, thank you so much for being here with me, for taking the time to listen to the podcast, for sharing your feedback, for asking questions. I really appreciate it so much. And stay tuned next Thursday for part 2 of highlights from podcasts of this year. And I'll see you then. Thanks again for listening. And if you enjoyed the conversation today, you found it valuable, and you want to support the podcast, the best way you can do that is to share the love. That way I can keep bringing you more tiny house conversations to help you on your own tiny journey. So here are 3 ways that you can support the podcast. Number 1, if you have a friend or family member that you feel would benefit from hearing these conversations, feel free to share it with them, email them, text them, send them a telegram, do whatever you need to do to share it with them. Number 2, if you hit the subscribe button, you'll know exactly when the next episode is live. And number 3, if you head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to podcasts and leave a 5-star rating and review. Thank you so much in advance. I appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next episode.